إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستهديه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فهو المهتدي ومن يضلل فلن تجد له وليا مرشدا وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما. قال الله تعالى في كتابه العزيز بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وإذ قال موسى لقومه يا قوم اذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ جعل فيكم أنبياء وجعلكم ملوكا وآتاكم ما لم يؤت أحدا من العالمين. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, all praise, glory and majesty belongs to Allah Azza wa Jalla alone. And we ask him to send his greatest peace and blessings upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and upon his family, and upon his companions, and upon all the believers until the day of judgment. Ya Rabbil Alameen. Allah Azza wa Jalla says in the Quran, what means in English, Moses said to his people, "My people, remember God's blessing on you, how he raised prophets among you and appointed you kings for you and gave you what he had not given to any other people." Musa alayhi salam and his people stood in the gates of Palestine, the culmination of a story that began with them being tortured as slaves, with their firstborn child or their male children being slaughtered, to the parting of the sea, to the point at which they reached the promised land, the land which they had heard about from their forefathers, and that they knew that in their scripture they were promised to enter into the lands of Palestine. And at that point, Musa alayhi salam, having gone through so much with his people, began to call upon them. He said, يا قوم ادخلوا الأرض المقدسة التي كتب الله لكم ولا ترتدوا على أدباركم فتنقلبوا خاسرين. He says, my people, go into the Holy Land, which God has ordained for you. Do not turn your back or you will be the losers. Musa alayhi salam, having witnessed and experienced so much truth, so many miracles, so much victory that Allah has promised him, endeared his people in a speech that must have been rivaled any other speech a leader has given before a battle, calling on his people that this is the moment, the final step, that if you enter, all you need to do is enter and Allah will grant you victory. Now this story will continue, but before we go ahead, I wanted to mention why are we joining this story and the purpose of the khutbah that we're here to talk about today. Today, we want to learn how to build our generation, to build the future of our community, to enable them to bring about the change for goodness, for beauty, for righteousness that we've been craving and wishing for so long. We've witnessed many, many things. We've seen many incidents in our life. We've seen horrendous calamities and we've seen tremendous beauties. What we can see from this story and the story that is to come is how Musa alayhi salam and his people built a generation. Now it may seem contradictory. Those who are aware of the story may feel, why this particular one, when actually it's a story of failure ultimately. Well, through learning from people's failures, we can pick up on our own successes. Through learning of how to plant the seeds, we can learn how to nurture them. Musa alayhi salam's story began well before Musa alayhi salam, from the time of Yusuf alayhi salam, a prophet who moved over to Egypt, not of his own choice, but he was sold into slavery. And there he went into prison after the horrendous act of the wife of his master, eventually ending up the treasurer of the country and enabling him to bring all his family. And from there the progeny and children of Israel, of Yaqub, began to spread. The children of Israel, as we commonly know them, our Jewish cousins, spread within Egypt. Now what's interesting in this story is how somebody of such tremendous influence, Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, a treasurer in a country, no less, somebody who established his footing in that place, within a few generations, those same people and their descendants would end up becoming the slaves of that very country. Allah doesn't tell us specifically what happened between those generations. But what it tells us is this effort isn't something you reach and then it finishes. Almost subtly within this story, Allah tells us well before, in another part of the surah, that these same people were previously from the establishment. They reached the goals, they reached the objectives, but somehow it slid away. So before we learn about how to build our generation, it's important and essential to understand that this is not a fixed point that we reach, but rather it's a continuous process, a process of which we have to train our people to think about and be aware of, a process of refinement, of tasawwuf, where you continually purify yourself and purify and work to purify society in order to ensure the work that you do continues. So in that mystery of a gap between Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, who was the treasurer of the country, what greater position and status could a person reach within the establishment of a country? A few generations they ended up as slaves. But just like that cycle goes down, Allah wants to demonstrate through the story of Musa how the cycle goes up. Musa alayhi salam came destroying the false prophet or the false god of Pharaoh, proving him to be nothing but a charlatan and a fake, as he challenged him with the greatest things that he had at that time, which was magic. He showed that it's Allah Azza wa Jal that is the true possessor of power and the true possessor of miracles. Now we return to this story. Musa alayhi salam, having fulfilled so much of what he promised and what Allah Azza wa Jal had promised to these people, they stood at the gates of their return to victory, their return to glory. Musa alayhi salam says, having known that all of them have witnessed the very same incidents that the Prophet ﷺ and the Prophet Musa alayhi salam witnessed. All of them had seen the splitting of the sea. All of them had seen the water turning into blood. All of them had seen the plagues of the locusts, etc., etc. All of them had seen these tremendous miracles pass before them. So Musa stood and gave this speech, calling upon them in a way only a prophet could do, with such certainty and conviction, with eloquence, telling them simply enter into the town and you will be victorious, because just look at the precedent we've had. How did his people respond? قالوا يا موسى إن فيها قوما جبارين وإنا لن ندخلها حتى يخرجوا منها فإن يخرجوا منها فإنا داخلون. His people respond, they say, Moses, there is a fearsome people in this land. We will not go there until they leave. If they leave, we will enter. These people had become chained to the shackles of this world, failing to see and connect the dots between all the miracles and all the gifts that Allah had given them, and that conviction that comes with it, that simply entering the city will give you victory. These people failed to see that, and instead could only see the immediate barriers that stood before them. Musa in his speech made no mention of even the people in that city. He just said, enter and you'll be victorious. But yet these people saw the first barrier enough to make them stop. Musa endears them. He says, قالوا يا موسى, he says, قال ربي إني لا أملك إلا نفسي وأخي. I missed an ayah. قالوا يا موسى إن فيها قوما جبارين. So at this point, two men stood up from these people. قال رجلان من الذين يخافون أنعم الله عليهما ادخلوا عليهم الباب فإذا دخلتموه فإنكم غالبون. At this point, two men stood up amongst the sea of people refusing to obey their prophet. A refusal to obey your prophet is tantamount to a refusal to obey your Lord. A command directly sent to him, because prophets don't speak of their own volition. Everything they say is revelation from their Lord. Two men stood up, and Allah interestingly describes them as saying, among those who were afraid. These people had the fear within them. They were scared just like everyone else was scared, but what they'd known, unlike the others, was how to control that fear, how to master it and how to channel it, knowing with certainty and experience that Allah Azza wa Jalla will give them victory. They said, just simply go into the city. They picked up on the words of Musa alayhi salam, and such were his words. Go into them through the gate, and when you go in, you will overcome them. If you are true believers, put your trust in your God. But yet, these people had this stubbornness. They said, Moses, we will never enter while you are still there. So you and your Lord go in and fight. We will stay right here. Now what I want to say is return to the topic of our conversation. How do we build a generation that can lead the change that we need to change? Musa alayhi salam, through the gifts and miracles that Allah Azza wa Jalla had given him, was able to defeat the greatest and most tyrannical ruler of that time in Pharaoh. Someone who claimed himself to be God on earth. These people had witnessed those very same miracles that led to that victory. And here they stand before another foe, an enemy of God who'd spread transgression across the world. But yet, they were unable to harness the energy and the benefits and the truth that Musa alayhi salam came in order to bring about that victory. We see in these people an element of pampering, that they almost became used to things being handed to them in a plate. This was a generation, after all, who'd seen victory come to them all at the behest of miracles. That Allah Azza wa Jalla had gifted them things that are unimaginable even to us today. What Allah Azza wa Jalla wants to show us in these people is that when things are given to you too easily, you become unable to activate and motivate your community to act. If Allah Azza wa Jalla today was to send about a storm, and that storm was to rid us of all the evil people, and only the good people will remain, yes, that might be the easy way, but it's not the lasting change that we need. It's not going to enable us to continue the generation of change that we need. Yes, it might be like Sayyidina Yusuf reached the pinnacle of where you can be in a society. But just like that past example, unless you can continue the efforts, you will continue to descend, to become in society the lowest of the low. And even if Allah Azza wa Jalla was to change everything within a few years, through the miraculous change that a prophet can bring, unless that change has come from yourselves, unless you have been part of that journey, unless you feel the struggle and work through that struggle, you will continue to say, well, Allah will bring victory again. Allah will bring victory again. These people had seen Allah Azza wa Jal bring such tremendous miracles, they just expected Musa alayhi salam to go alone with Allah, defeat the people, and then they can just walk in. All handed to them in a plate. Now, what we witness next is perhaps one of the most interesting parts of this story. Traditionally, it's described as a punishment. Musa alayhi salam complains, he said, Lord, I have no authority over no one except myself and my brother. Judge between the two of us and these disobedient people. Of course, disobedience of a prophet is tantamount to disobeying Allah. And the sin of that is grievous, it's massive. But I want to just reframe the way we're looking at this slightly. These people were promised this land, but they clearly were incapable of working towards earning it. So they had to be put through the cauldron, the test, the fire pit, in order to obtain the skills that would allow them to reach the necessary threshold to be able to enter. Allah says, the land is forbidden for them for 40 years. They will wander the earth aimlessly. Do not grieve over those who disobey. Allah Azza brought about the natural consequence of our inaction. And that's the way I want us to see things. We don't see punishment as punishment, but we see it as consequences. Consequences to the very acts that we did upon ourselves, or the very acts that society has done which we have failed to address. When we wonder why our children are struggling to pray and are not motivated, it's because we haven't made prayer something established in our homes, something established in our communities. If you were to be praying every day together as a family, it would be unthinkable for your child to think, I need to step away from prayer. So even if you're praying yourself, it's important about creating that community and that environment to do so. Now that's not a punishment. Allah's not punishing you necessarily for your child's sin and your child's disobedience. Of course He can do that. But see it as a consequence of perhaps something that you are doing wrong. And if you can fix that wrong thing, Allah will give us victory. Allah put these people through the cauldron of 40 years wandering in the desert. The scholars have described within this time, every single person within this generation who witnessed that incident had passed away. Until the later prophets came. The prophets which stood before the next generation who'd heard these tales of these people. Now what's interesting here is the first story I mentioned, all these ayahs come in Surah Al-Ma'idah, in Surah 5. The ayahs I'm about to convey to you come well before in Surah Al-Baqarah. Now the Quran isn't necessarily read in order, linearly. But if it were to be, a person would obtain the stories that explain the victory before Allah explains the story of their failure. Allah knows that from our generations, 2, 3, 4 generations later, there will be a people who will be righteous and make Islam proud to boast these people as amongst their followers. And because of those people, and because of that truth, Allah is sustaining us and allows us to survive. That chronology of story, which things appear, allow us to see the insight, that you understand the consequence before you see the failure. These people came to a following prophet. Allah says, Alam tara ila al-mala'i min bani Israel. Prophet, consider the leaders of the children of Israel, who came up after Moses. When they said to one of their prophets, set up a king for us, and we shall fight in God's cause. Now notice the difference here. These people had learnt their lesson. They realized they had to be proactive, and they had to ask Allah for His aid. This time it wasn't 1 or 2 people, but it was a critical mass. It was an acceptance of a large number of people. It went from being Musa alayhi salam and his brother and 2 lone men who supported him, to being almost a recognized need from these people in order to obtain their victory. From there, Musa alayhi salam had passed, and his brother had passed. And it was another unnamed prophet within this ayah, and unnamed within the hadith. But we know this prophet was his servant boy. Now, what's interesting within this story, and for the sake of time we'll have to skip some of the details, is that we witness the sequence of events that Allah Azza wa Jal places upon these people. The first is that they request for themselves a king. They request for themselves a leader. So Allah Azza wa Jal says, وَقَالَ لَهُمْ نَبِيُّهُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ بَعَثَ لَكُمْ طَالُوتَ مَلِكًا. Their prophet said to them, God has now appointed Talut to be your king. But they said, how can he be king over us when we have greater rights to rule than he? Even in this Reformation, there were still people who had corruption within their hearts. Even though they recognized the need to turn to Allah, they still failed to see that it's Allah Azza wa Jal that's giving them these gifts. He's giving them that direction. But despite that, they accept the signs. And Allah Azza wa Jal, perhaps miraculously, shows us that He brings down a tabut, a cabinet, carrying the relics of Musa alayhi salam and the relics of Harun. And in there was tremendous peace, and they would see angels bringing it down from the sky. This incident, despite those people having really already needed or not needed any signs from Allah Azza wa Jal to bring them awareness of this king, Allah Azza wa Jal sent them a miracle just to prove that His judgment was right, just to set their hearts firm. Even though we should be learning our lessons around the world and what we're facing, even though we should be in the situations that we're seeing, in this tremendous calamity that we're seeing amongst COVID, should be enough of a sign for us. Allah Azza wa Jal will continue to remind us on a personal level, will continue to send us signs until we turn back to Him. Now after this, Talut was made king. And we see Talut travel on his expedition until they see a lake of water. And he tells the people, no one should drink from it except a small grasp of their hands. At this point, the vast majority differ from Talut. They refuse to take his command. And they begin to drink some of the water more than what he had allowed them. So they went from being the vast majority of people agreeing to only a significant minority who remained with him, obeying his command. After this, Talut alayhi salam reached the river and passed the river. And then came the pessimists, those who continued with him but still began to feel that negativity, something we all see so rife within our community. Even when everything's going right, they're with you. But when things go to bad, these are the people that complain the loudest. They're constantly, oh no, it's going to be difficult, it's going to be hard, etc. And finally, a smaller group amongst those people, divided of course into the pessimists and then these optimists, who responded, how often a small force has defeated a large army with God's permission. Musa alayhi salam had passed, and these people had learnt that a single prophet was able to defeat the kingdom of Pharaoh. And these people took that optimism and carried it even in the most difficult of times. So Allah whittled down from it being the community agreeing that we need a king, to being the majority to accepting Talut as a king, to being a minority who agreed with him and followed him to the T, to being a small portion who remained optimistic even in the difficult times, to becoming a small number of people who were able to see it all through. And then finally the emergence of a gem, Dawood alayhi salam, who is the only one mentioned in any of this sequence of battles. Allah Azza wa Jal says in the ayah, وَلَمَّا بَرَزَ لِجَالُوتَ وَجُنُودِهِ قالوا ربنا أفرغ علينا صبرا وثبت أقدامنا وانصرنا على القوم الكافرين فهزموهم بإذن الله وقاتل داود جالوتا. Allah says, and when they met Goliath and his warriors, they said, our Lord, pour patience on us, make us stand firm and help us against the disbelievers. And so God, with God's permission, they defeated them. David killed Goliath, and God gave sovereignty and wisdom and taught him what he pleased. Now in this story, what's interesting, imagine watching a film, and there's the build-up to the film, and there's the prequel and all the story, and then you reach the battle, and then suddenly it cuts and you see the end scene where the person is victorious. Allah hasn't mentioned any of the bits in between. And what we of course know is this must have been a ferocious battle. Jalut, or Goliath, was infamous for his stature, his physicality, and his fierceness on the battlefield. But yet, Allah didn't see it as important to mention any of the details within that battle. The only thing He mentioned was how Dawood, one of the youngest people in that place, rose to be a gem, able to kill the most ferocious of those people. He wanted to show within this story how we build a generation. How we build a generation from those people who failed at the time of Musa to their wanderings within the desert until a critical mass can be built where the majority opinion, the public opinion, is of agreement that something should be done. The majority are willing to do something. A minority are willing to see it through. A handful remain optimistic, and then only one or two emerge as gems. How did the story pan out? And what are some of the lessons we can take from this? We see the first is that the longer we leave things to do, the harder they become. At the time of Musa alayhi salam, it was Musa alayhi salam who said, just enter and you'll be given victory. But by the time it came to Talut and the king Talut, they had to assemble a large army in order to fight what was an even greater oppressor against the people. The longer you leave deeds or sins to continue, the harder they become to fix. And there we have the first lesson of how to build our generation. Train them to be proactive, to fix things immediately. Don't let them get used to settling on bad behavior, settling on bad character. Correct their mistake at the first moment. The first time you hear someone swear, correct them. Say this is a bad habit. The Prophet ﷺ says, he is not one of us who uses foul language. And train them to have a beautiful tongue in the way they speak. Because if you correct that, it stops the harder problems that come later on. The negative influence that they've adopted from their friends. So the first thing we can see in how to build a generation is that we have to correct things first. We have to do things early before the problem exacerbates. The second is that we're not aiming to reach a goal and a finish line, but rather we're aiming to reach what we call almost a status quo, a point at which normality and the circumstance is that people are conscious of God. And we have to work hard to continue that status quo. Because just as Yusuf alayhi salam rose to become a treasurer of Egypt, part of the establishment, if left unchecked, we can let ourselves slip to become the slaves of our society if we abandon our own faith. The third is that we need a critical mass of people in order for change to come about. It's not enough for us to rely on a community of one or two people. You will only see success when you begin to see 30, 40, 100 people working together, even if only doing their small part. Allah didn't single out a single person except Dawood alayhi salam right at the end, during the battle that Talut waged. But He chose to single out two people who stood during their people's disobedience of the Prophet ﷺ. If you could be from the foremost people who stand out, those two people were not prophets. They were just people amongst their nation. But when you do things first, and when you do things proactively, Allah singles you out and notices you. Because when you can stand up against the crowd to stand up for truth, you will begin to see Allah giving you favors and gifts that no other person will be given. What greater gift can we have than to be mentioned in the Quran? The very words of Allah Azza wa Jal, which is recited by people since the time of the Prophet ﷺ till the end of time. The third and perhaps interesting element is the importance of stories. We see within the story how Musa alayhi salam had told these people that they were promised this land. How the following generations held on to the relics of Musa alayhi salam, the relics of Harun. They were told stories of the promised land. They were told stories of things that had failed before them in order to motivate them to change and to improve. If we want to build our generation, we have to build powerful stories and narratives to inspire our kids to rise up, to become the leaders of their society. One of the most powerful things that you can do is teach your child the meaning of their name and the legacy of people before them who were named the same name. My own parents named me Talha after one of the great companions of the Prophet ﷺ, and it's always been my wish to try and emulate him, and something that I've aspired to have. Those of you who are called Abdullah, teach your children of the 4 Abdullahs who the Prophet ﷺ described as the jurists, the great scholars of that city. If your daughter is named Fatima, teach her of how this lady is the queen of paradise and what she did to obtain such a level. If she's named Asma, describe how Asma carried in 7 months pregnancy food and drink to the Prophet ﷺ in the cave of Hira, and the many children she bore in the name of Islam, people who grew to become great people in our legacy and tradition. Give stories, give emblems for our children to hold on to. And inshallah you will see the fruits of those stories later. And finally, or penultimately, don't be a pessimist. Be somebody who, in all the difficulties and all the circumstances that you faced, look at the bright side. We didn't have time to break down the speech of Musa alayhi salam, but go back and read it. You will notice he could have picked up on anything. He could have looked at the negatives. He could have even phrased things as saying, you were in slavery and Allah brought you out. But rather he didn't. He said, you were given this gift. You were given these bounties. You were given so much. And Allah will give you victory even if you just walk into the city. The prophetic optimism that Musa carried, alayhi salam, and the optimism of other people carried through such that even those who were optimistic with Talut in his battle were made mention of in the Quran. Today we have so many naysayers. We have people who, anything, will look at the negatives. We'll look at how difficult the world is, how much of a failure we all are. See the many beauties that we have in our community and begin to be optimistic. Because when you thank Allah, Allah will increase you. And finally, realize that change takes time. Musa alayhi salam, in an instant, Pharaoh was drowned through the parting of the sea. But it took a lifetime beyond his own before he would see the true change amongst his people that would enable them to enter into the promised land. Musa alayhi salam died before he saw the legacy of his work. But the thing that he did in planting the seeds within his community led to that change which we now see. Be a part of the process which will lead to the victory later on. Be like those 2 men who stood up in a sea of disobedience and said, we will follow you, O Musa and O Harun alayhi salam. Be from those who are working towards good, even if that good seems so far away. And inshallah, through the bounties and the graces of Allah Azza wa Jal, we will see victory sooner rather than later. We want to build our generation, and these are some practical steps, inshallah. The story is very long, and there are very many details within the story which we could expound upon. But Allah gives us opportunity. We'll look to go into these further in another khutbah. Jazakallah khair. Unfortunately, this is not a actual Jum'ah Salah. It's in place of the Jum'ah Salah as a khutbah in order to fulfill some of the blessings that we can take from this Friday, but you're still required to stand up and pray your 4 rakats for Salatul Dhuhr, unlike the 2 rakats. And if you can pray as a family, that will get you even more reward. The Prophet ﷺ said if you pray in congregation, the prayer in congregation is worth 27 times the prayer of one alone. One of the beautiful things I heard from one of the kids in our youth group is they've continued the habit of Ramadan of praying together as a family. And he said it's brought them closer together. They are forced to meet 5 times a day to say salams, to speak to one another. That's the blessings and the beauties that 5 times of prayer in congregation do. Establish that habit within your family and allow yourself to continue what you started in Ramadan. جزاكم الله خير. قولي قولي هذا استغفر الله لي ولكم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.